The gangplank swayed under my boots as I stepped aboard the Leviathan, my equipment bag weighing down my shoulder and excitement buzzing through my chest. I'd been waiting 3 months for this deep-sea expedition, and the research vessel looked exactly like what I'd imagined. Steel hull gleaming with fresh paint, research equipment secured to every available deck space, and that particular smell of salt air mixed with diesel fuel that meant serious ocean work ahead. Captain Thomas Steadman appeared at the top of the gangplank before I'd even made it halfway up. He was older than I'd expected, maybe mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades at sea. But something about his posture struck me as off, too rigid, like he was forcing himself to stand straight. "Dr. Campbell, welcome aboard," he said, extending a hand that trembled slightly as I shook it. "Hope you're ready for some real research." I followed him across the deck, taking in the layout of winches and sample containers, the submersible secured near the stern. Everything looked professional, well-maintained, the kind of setup that should have made any marine biologist feel confident about the work ahead. "Crew briefing in 10 minutes, Steadman said, leading me toward what I assumed was the main cabin. "Got some charts to show everyone." The way he said it made me glance back at him. There was an edge in his voice that didn't match the routine nature of pre-expedition briefings I'd attended before. Most captains delivered these meetings with practiced calm, running through safety protocols and research schedules like they'd done it 100 times. Steadman looked like he was preparing for something more serious. The briefing room was cramped but functional, with a large table covered in nautical charts and what looked like sonar printouts. I counted 8 crew members total, including myself. Most faces were unfamiliar, though I recognized Dr. Martinez from the marine biology department. Steadman took his position at the head of the table and spread out the charts with hands that shook enough for me to notice from across the room. "We're heading to coordinates 34-12N, 121-47W, he said, pointing to a spot on the chart that looked like empty ocean. 200 miles west of Point Sur. Deep water, nearly 3 miles to the bottom in some areas. I leaned forward to get a better look at the charts. The target area was marked with red ink, surrounded by depth soundings and current notations. Standard deep-sea research setup, except for the way Steadman kept glancing between the charts and the crew, like he was measuring our reactions. Water samples, sediment cores, biological surveys, he continued, running through the research objectives with mechanical precision. "But I want to make something clear from the start." He paused, meeting each person's eyes individually. "We follow safety protocols to the letter out there. No exceptions, no improvisation, no unnecessary risks." Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Captain, we're all experienced researchers. We understand." "You understand coastal work," Steadman cut him off, his voice sharper than necessary. "This is different. Deep water has its own rules." He tapped the chart again, harder this time. "We respect those rules or we don't come back." The room went quiet. I found myself studying Steadman's face, trying to read the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers kept drumming against the table edge. In 15 years of marine research, I'd worked with dozens of ship captains. Most were cautious by nature, had to be, given the risks of ocean work. But this felt different, personal almost. "Questions?" Steadman asked, already gathering the charts like the meeting was over. Nobody spoke. The whole briefing had lasted maybe 10 minutes, covering less detail than I'd expected for a week-long expedition. Usually these sessions included equipment checks, emergency procedures, detailed timeline discussions. Instead, we'd gotten coordinates and warnings. As the crew filed out, I hung back, hoping to get a better sense of what we were actually doing out there. But Steadman was already heading for the door, charts tucked under his arm like classified documents. "Captain," I called after him. "Any particular species we're targeting? Specific geological features?" He turned back, and for a moment his expression seemed almost haunted. "We're looking for whatever's down there, Dr. Campbell. Hopefully nothing we can't handle." Before I could ask what that meant, he was gone. I stood in the empty briefing room for another minute, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The charts had shown standard bathymetric data, nothing unusual about the depth contours or bottom composition. The research objectives were routine. But Steadman's behavior suggested we were sailing into something far more complex than a typical scientific survey. The galley turned out to be located one deck down, and the smell of coffee and cooking meat drew me there as much as hunger. I found a compact but well-organized kitchen space where a stocky man in his 40s was working over a gas burner, stirring something that smelled like chili. "You must be the marine biologist," he said without looking up. "Sam Rodriguez. I keep everyone fed on this floating laboratory." "David Campbell," I said, accepting the coffee cup he handed me. "Thanks. That briefing was interesting." Sam glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "Yeah. Steadman's been wound pretty tight lately. Weeks now, actually. Ever since this expedition got approved." I sipped the coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, and studied Sam's face. He had the kind of open, honest expression that made people want to confide in him. The type of guy who probably heard every piece of ship gossip within hours of it happening. "Wound tight how?" I asked. "Checking weather reports 3 times a day. Running sonar sweeps when we're still in port. Yesterday I caught him in the equipment bay at 2 in the morning going through the emergency beacon supplies." Sam shrugged, but his eyes showed genuine concern. "Look, I've worked with Steadman for 6 years. He's always been careful, but this is different. He's scared of something." That word "scared" hung in the air between us. Ship captains didn't get scared of routine research expeditions. They worried about weather, equipment failures, crew safety. But fear, that suggested something I couldn't identify yet. "Any idea what?" I asked. Sam shook his head. "He won't talk about it. But I'll tell you one thing. He's been avoiding the sonar station during normal operations. Won't even look at the depth readings unless he has to. For a captain, that's like avoiding the steering wheel." The engines rumbled to life beneath our feet, vibrating through the deck plates. I could hear crew members moving around topside, probably preparing to cast off. My excitement about the expedition was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Curiosity about what had Steadman so spooked. "Thanks for the coffee," I said, "and the heads up. Just keep your eyes open out there, Dr. Campbell. Something tells me this isn't going to be your typical research cruise." I climbed back topside as the Leviathan began moving away from the dock. San Diego Harbor spread out around us, busy with commercial traffic and pleasure boats heading back to port as the afternoon wore on. The familiar sights should have been comforting. I'd departed from this harbor dozens of times for shorter research trips. Instead, I found myself paying attention to how quickly the land receded behind us. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon by the time we cleared the harbor entrance and turned west into open ocean. I made my way to the bridge, partly to check our heading and partly because I wanted another look at Steadman's behavior when he thought the crew wasn't watching. I found him exactly where I'd expected, standing over the sonar display, his hands gripping the console edge. The screen showed the familiar pattern of decreasing depth as we moved away from the continental shelf. Standard readings for our position, nothing unusual about the bottom contours or water column data. But Steadman was staring at that screen like it might reveal something terrible at any moment. "Making good time," I said, stepping up beside him. He jumped slightly, then straightened. Dr. Campbell, yes. Currents with us. Should reach the research area by tomorrow afternoon. I looked at the sonar display myself, noting the clean bottom return and empty water column. Looks like clear sailing. Good conditions for the work. For now, he said, and something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. His face was pale, almost gray in the bridge lighting. The tremor in his hands had gotten worse since the briefing, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool air coming through the open bridge windows. Captain, are you feeling all right? He turned away from the sonar screen, but not before I caught him checking it one more time. Just want to make sure we're following the right course. These waters, they require respect. Any particular hazards I should know about? Shipping lanes, weather patterns? Steadman was quiet for a long moment, watching the horizon where the sun was painting the sky orange and red. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. The deep ocean holds things that aren't meant to be disturbed, Dr. Campbell. Sometimes the best research is knowing when to stay away. Before I could ask what he meant, he walked away from the sonar station, leaving me alone with the steady ping of the depth sounder and a growing sense that this expedition was about much more than water samples and sediment cores. I stayed on the bridge until full darkness settled over the water, watching our position move steadily west on the GPS display. The sonar continued its monotonous cycle, showing nothing but empty water and distant bottom. Normal readings for normal ocean. But Steadman's words echoed in my head as we sailed deeper into the Pacific, carrying us toward coordinates that seemed to hold more significance than a routine research site. The Leviathan cut through gentle swells under a sky full of stars, her engines maintaining steady rhythm as we moved farther from land. I found myself wondering what we were really going to find out there, and why Captain Steadman seemed so certain it would be something we shouldn't disturb. Whatever it was, we'd know soon enough. The water sample container slipped from my hands as the sonar alarm cut through the afternoon quiet, its metallic clang against the deck barely audible over the sudden electronic beeping from the bridge. I'd been bent over the collection apparatus for the better part of an hour, cataloging specimens from our morning trawl, when the sound made every crew member on deck freeze mid-motion. 3 days of routine sailing had brought us exactly where Steadman's charts indicated. Coordinates 34 degree 12 N, 121 degree 47 W, 200 miles from the nearest shipping lane. The isolation felt complete out here, with nothing but endless blue stretching to every horizon. Perfect conditions for deep-sea research, if you could ignore the way our captain had spent those 3 days prowling the deck like a caged animal. Dr. Martinez looked up from his own sample containers, eyebrows raised in question. The sonar alarm wasn't supposed to go off during normal operations. It was programmed to alert us only when something unusual appeared on the readings, something big enough or unexpected enough to warrant immediate attention. I wiped my hands on a rag and headed for the bridge, leaving the samples half-cataloged. Through the pilot house windows, I could see Steadman hunched over the sonar display, his shoulders rigid with tension. The tremor in his hands had gotten worse over the past 3 days, and now his whole body seemed to vibrate with nervous energy. The sonar screen showed our position suspended over an abyssal plain nearly 3 miles deep. Standard bathymetric data for this region. Flat, featureless bottom composition, with typical sediment layers. But something else was showing up on the display now, something that made my marine biology training struggle to find an explanation. "What am I looking at, Captain?" I asked, stepping up beside him. Steadman's face had gone gray and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool ocean breeze flowing through the bridge. His finger trembled as he pointed to a massive signature on the screen, a dark shape that seemed to pulse with each sonar sweep. "Bottom disturbance," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Probably geological activity. Underwater landslide, maybe." I studied the readings more carefully. The signature was enormous, easily 1,000 feet across, maybe more. But geological formations didn't move, and this thing was definitely moving. Slowly, but with purpose, shifting position with each sweep of the sonar array. "Sir, that reading is showing vertical displacement," I said. "Landslides move horizontally. This is moving up." Steadman's hands gripped the console edge until his knuckles went white. "Equipment malfunction. Has to be. These old sonar units, they get interference from thermal layers, fish schools. But I'd worked with sonar equipment for 15 years, and I knew what fish schools looked like on the display. They showed up as scattered, shifting clouds of small contacts. This was a single, massive object maintaining its shape and position, while slowly ascending from the ocean floor. "Captain, this signature is nearly 3 miles down. What kind of marine life operates at that depth and size?" Before Steadman could answer, Sam appeared in the bridge doorway with a coffee tray, his usual friendly expression clouded with concern. He set the cups down and moved close enough to speak quietly. "Dr. Campbell, the captain hasn't slept in 2 days," Sam murmured, glancing toward Steadman, who was still fixated on the sonar screen. "Caught him on deck at 3 this morning, pacing the rail and muttering something about staying quiet. When I asked if he wanted coffee, he just kept saying, 'We need to stay quiet,' over and over. I accepted the coffee cup gratefully, using the moment to observe Steadman's behavior. The captain was studying the sonar readings with the intensity of someone watching for a specific threat, not the curiosity of someone trying to identify an unknown contact. His whole posture suggested he knew exactly what he was looking at and was terrified by the implications. "Any idea what's got him spooked?" I asked Sam in an equally quiet voice. "He's been avoiding the sonar station during normal watches," Sam replied. "Only comes up here when the readings show something unusual, like he's watching for something specific." The sonar contact pulsed again, and I noticed it had risen several hundred feet since we'd first detected it. Whatever was down there, it was ascending at a steady rate, too steady to be natural current action or equipment drift. "Dr. Campbell," Dr. Martinez called from the deck below. "We're ready for the afternoon submersible deployment. Depth charges are loaded, cameras are calibrated." I looked to Steadman for approval, but the captain was already shaking his head before I could speak. "Negative," he said, his voice sharp. "Equipment malfunction. Submersible operations are canceled until further notice." Martinez's voice carried frustration. "Captain, I ran full diagnostics this morning. All systems are functioning perfectly. We've got optimal conditions for deep water observation." Steadman turned away from the sonar display, and for the first time in 3 days, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not caution or professional concern, actual terror. "I said negative, Dr. Martinez. No submersible operations today." I knew Martinez was right about the equipment. I'd helped with the morning diagnostics myself, running tests on the cameras, manipulator arms, and life support systems. Everything was functioning at peak efficiency. The submersible was ready for deployment, and conditions were ideal for the deep water research we'd come here to conduct. But Steadman was lying about equipment malfunctions, and his reason for canceling the dive had nothing to do with mechanical problems. "Captain," I said carefully, "what exactly are we looking for out here?" Steadman's attention snapped back to the sonar screen, where the massive contact continued its slow ascent. The signature had gained another 100 feet in just the few minutes we'd been talking. "We're not looking for anything, Dr. Campbell. We're documenting deep-sea conditions in this region. Standard research protocols. But his binoculars were hanging around his neck, and I noticed they were focused on the water surface, not the horizon. He was watching for something to emerge from the depths, expecting it to surface near our position. As afternoon turned toward evening, the sonar readings intensified. The massive presence below had risen to within 2 miles of the surface, and its movements were becoming more pronounced. Whatever was down there, it was responding to our presence, moving toward us with increasing purpose. Sam brought dinner to the bridge, but Steadman ignored the food completely. He stood over the sonar console like a man watching his own execution, monitoring the contact's steady ascent. "Sir," I said, "we should radio our position to the Coast Guard, if there's geological activity in this area." "No radio traffic," Steadman cut me off. "Absolute radio silence until further notice." The order made no sense from a safety perspective. We were 200 miles from the nearest shipping lane, operating without backup communication in some of the deepest water on the Pacific coast. Standard protocol required regular position reports and communication windows. But Steadman wasn't thinking about standard protocol. He was thinking about something that had happened before, something that made him believe radio silence was necessary for survival. As darkness settled over the water, Steadman finally stepped away from the sonar station and headed for the ship's intercom. His hands shook as he reached for the microphone, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "All crew to the main deck for emergency briefing. Immediately." The crew assembled quickly, sensing the urgency in Steadman's tone. Dr. Martinez, Sam, 3 Marine technicians, and the engine room operator all gathered around the captain, waiting for an explanation of the day's strange behavior. Steadman cleared his throat and tried to project authority, but his trembling voice betrayed his fear. "We'll be maintaining our current position through the night for critical observations," he announced. "All crew members will remain on deck watch in rotating shifts. No one goes below decks alone, and no one approaches the rail without a partner." Dr. Martinez raised his hand. "Captain, what exactly are we observing?" The research schedule called for sample collection and submersible deployment. "Change of plans," Steadman replied, glancing toward the dark water surrounding our hull. "We're monitoring environmental conditions, deep water phenomena that require careful documentation." His binoculars were trained on the ocean surface again, scanning back and forth as if searching for the first sign of something breaking through. The sonar contact was still rising, now less than a mile beneath our keel, and Steadman knew exactly what was coming. I found myself studying the water too, watching for any change in the gentle swells that surrounded the Leviathan. The ocean looked normal, dark, peaceful, with just enough moonlight to show the wave patterns extending to the horizon. But something massive was ascending toward us from the abyssal depths, something Steadman recognized and feared. As the crew dispersed to their assigned watch positions, I stayed near the bridge, keeping one eye on the sonar display and one eye on our captain's increasingly erratic behavior. Whatever was rising from the depths had been down there for millions of years, waiting in the cold darkness of the deep ocean. And somehow, Captain Steadman knew exactly what it was. The deck plates buckled beneath my feet as something enormous slammed into the Leviathan's hull from below. The impact threw me sideways into the sample collection apparatus, sending glass containers and metal instruments clattering across the deck in a symphony of breaking equipment. Emergency lighting flickered throughout the ship as the entire vessel shuddered from bow to stern. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the nearest rail for support as aftershocks continued to ripple through the ship's frame. The deck around me was littered with broken glass and scattered research gear. 3 days of careful preparation destroyed in seconds. Dr. Martinez had been thrown against the starboard winch, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead as he struggled to stand. Steadman's voice cut through the chaos from the bridge, raw with panic and desperation. "Secure all exterior lights. Every deck light. Every cabin window. Everything goes dark now." His words carried across the water with an urgency that made my skin crawl. "Absolute silence on deck. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks." I looked around at the scattered crew members, all of us trying to process what had just happened. The impact had felt like a collision with an underwater mountain, but our sonar readings showed nothing but empty water beneath us. Nothing except that massive signature we'd been tracking for hours. The bridge lights went out first, plunging the pilot house into darkness. Then the deck lights followed, one section at a time, until the Leviathan floated in complete blackness under the star-filled sky. The only remaining illumination came from the moon and the faint glow of essential navigation equipment. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized we weren't actually surrounded by blackness at all. Deep beneath the surface, strange lights pulsed around our hull like some kind of underwater aurora. Blue-green phosphorescence moved in slow, hypnotic patterns, forming shapes that almost looked deliberate. The light stretched far beyond our ship's outline, suggesting something massive moving in the depths directly below us. Sam appeared beside me, his face pale in the moonlight. He grabbed my arm and pointed toward the water, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus Christ, David. Look at that." The bioluminescent display was intensifying, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow with purpose. Concentric circles of light expanded outward from a central point beneath our keel, pulsing in rhythm like a giant heartbeat. The effect was mesmerizing, almost beautiful, if you could forget that something was creating those lights intentionally. I forced myself to look away from the water and focus on the sonar screen visible through the bridge windows. The massive contact was there, right beneath us, so large it filled most of the display. But now the signature was showing details that made my marine biology training struggle for explanations. Branching appendages extending in multiple directions, sections that pulsed and moved independently. Steadman stumbled down from the bridge, his face haggard, and his hands shaking worse than I'd ever seen them. He moved like a man walking to his own execution, each step requiring tremendous effort. When he reached the main deck, he gathered the crew around him with gestures that demanded absolute silence. 15 years ago, he began, his voice cracking with emotion. I was captain of a research vessel called the Aurora. We were conducting deep-water surveys in the Mendocino Fracture Zone, following reports of unusual sonar contacts and strange lights seen by commercial fishing vessels. He paused, staring down at the bioluminescent patterns still pulsing beneath our hull. The lights had grown brighter, creating shapes that looked almost like tentacles reaching upward through the water. "We found what we were looking for," Steadman continued. "A creature so large, it defied classification. Colossal doesn't begin to describe it. Hundreds of feet long, with appendages that could reach the surface from depths of 3 miles. It had bioluminescent organs covering its entire body, patterns that could hypnotize and disorient anyone who looked at them too long." Dr. Martinez wiped blood from his forehead, trying to focus on Steadman's words while the ship continued to rock gently from residual motion. The creature below us was moving, creating subtle waves that suggested massive displacement of water. "The Aurora was destroyed," Steadman said, torn apart by appendages that crushed steel like paper. 32 crew members died that day, pulled into the depths or drowned when the ship went down. I survived because I was thrown clear during the first attack, managed to reach a life raft before the beast finished its work. I found myself staring at the water again, watching the hypnotic light patterns pulse and swirl. There was something compelling about the display, a beauty that made it difficult to look away. The rational part of my mind knew I should be terrified, but the lights seemed to whisper that everything would be fine if I just kept watching. The creature didn't hunt randomly, Steadman continued, his voice growing more urgent. It targeted specific individuals, somehow reading their thoughts or emotions. It would project images, voices, memories of dead relatives and lost loved ones. People would hear their deceased children calling from the water, see their dead spouses beckoning from the depths. Ernesto Torres, one of our marine technicians, suddenly gripped the deck rail with white knuckles. His eyes were wide and unfocused, staring down at the bioluminescent display as if seeing something the rest of us couldn't perceive. "Papa," he whispered, his voice filled with longing and pain. "Papa, I can hear Maria. She's calling for me." Sam moved toward Ernesto, reaching out to pull him away from the rail. But Ernesto shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face as he leaned farther over the water. "She's down there," he said, his voice breaking. "My little girl is down there, and she needs me. She's been waiting so long, calling for her papa to come home." I realized with growing horror that Ernesto was talking about his daughter who had died in a car accident 2 years ago. Somehow the creature was using his grief against him, projecting the voice of his dead child to lure him into the water. Looking around the deck, I noticed other crew members exhibiting similar behavior. Dr. Martinez was staring blankly at the water, his lips moving silently as if responding to a conversation only he could see. One of the marine technicians had moved closer to the rail, his expression vacant and dreamy. The bioluminescent patterns were growing more intense, pulsing faster and creating increasingly complex shapes. The lights seemed to reach into my mind, suggesting images of my own dead parents, promising reunion and peace if I would just step over the rail and join them in the depths. I forced myself to look away from the water, focusing on Steadman's haggard face instead. The captain was watching his crew with the expression of a man witnessing his worst nightmare coming true. "It feeds on guilt and regret," Steadman said, raising his voice to cut through the creature's mental influence. "The beast can sense emotional pain and use it as a weapon. It projects hallucinations, false promises, anything to make people believe their dead loved ones are waiting in the water." Ernesto was now climbing onto the rail, balanced precariously over the dark ocean. Sam grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back, but Ernesto fought against the restraint with surprising strength. "Let me go," Ernesto shouted. "She needs me. Maria has been alone down there for so long." The lights below pulsed brighter, and I felt the compulsion hit me like a physical force. Suddenly, I could hear my father's voice calling from the depths, see my mother's face forming in the bioluminescent patterns. They were telling me how much they missed me, how the cancer had been quick and painless, how they'd been waiting for me to join them in the peaceful darkness below. My feet moved toward the rail without conscious decision. The water looked warm and inviting, and the voices of my parents grew clearer with each step. All I had to do was climb over the side and swim down to where they waited with arms outstretched. "David." Sam's voice cut through the hallucination like a knife. "Don't look at the water. Focus on my voice, not the lights." I jerked back to awareness, realizing I was standing at the rail with one leg already over the side. The compulsion was still there, pulling at my mind like an undertow, but Sam's intervention had broken the creature's hold long enough for rational thought to return. Steadman was screaming warnings now, his voice hoarse with desperation. "The lights are how it controls you. Don't look directly at the patterns. Keep your eyes on the deck, on each other, anywhere but the water." But his warnings came too late for some of the crew. Dr. Martinez had moved to the port rail, speaking quietly to someone only he could see. Two of the marine technicians were arguing with invisible figures, their eyes reflecting the hypnotic glow from below. The creature's bioluminescent display reached a crescendo, creating patterns so beautiful and complex they seemed to contain entire galaxies of meaning. The lights promised answers to every question, relief from every pain, reunion with everyone we'd ever lost. All we had to do was step into the water and let the darkness embrace us. I gripped the deck rail until my knuckles went white, fighting against every instinct that told me to dive into those welcoming depths. Around me, the crew of the Leviathan stood on the edge of madness, each of us battling our own private demons, as an ancient predator reached up from the abyss to claim new victims. The cold metal of the deck rail bit into my palms as I gripped it, fighting off another wave of my parents' voices calling from the depths. The bioluminescent display below had pulsed all night like a massive heartbeat, growing brighter with each hour that passed. I'd managed maybe an hour of broken sleep against the bridge wall, jerking awake whenever the creature's whispers grew too loud in my mind. Dawn crept across the Pacific in pale gray light, revealing a deck scattered with the wreckage of our research equipment and something far worse. Ernesto's orange life jacket hung neatly on the port rail, its straps arranged with careful precision. The man himself was nowhere to be found. I checked the jacket's position twice, hoping I'd made some mistake. The straps were buckled and adjusted to Ernesto's size, but the jacket itself was bone dry. No signs of struggle, no torn fabric or blood. He'd simply removed it, folded it carefully, and stepped into the dark water sometime during the night. Sam appeared beside me, his face drawn with exhaustion and something approaching despair. He'd been helping me maintain a rotating watch system, making sure nobody spent too long alone near the rail. Obviously, we'd failed. "Found him?" Sam asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Just the jacket. He's been gone for hours." Sam nodded grimly and gestured toward the crew scattered around the deck. "We've got bigger problems than Ernesto." I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Dr. Martinez sat near the starboard winch, his back straight and his eyes fixed on the water with an unblinking stare. His lips moved constantly, carrying on a conversation with someone only he could see. Occasionally, he'd nod or shake his head, responding to words the rest of us couldn't hear. Two of the marine technicians stood at opposite rails, both staring into the creature's pulsing lights below. Their faces held the same vacant expression I'd seen on Ernesto before he disappeared. Peaceful, content, like people listening to their favorite music. One of them, Rodriguez, was crying silent tears while smiling at the water. "How long have they been like this?" I asked. "Martinez started around 3 this morning. The others maybe an hour ago. They're not responding to questions or commands. Just watching the lights and talking to dead people." I moved closer to Dr. Martinez, trying to get his attention without blocking his view of the water. The moment I stepped between him and the rail, his expression changed to panic and anger. "Move," he said sharply. "She can't see me if you're standing there." "Who can't see you, doctor?" "My sister. Anna's been looking for me for 30 years, since the accident." His voice cracked with emotion. "I was driving that night. I was drunk, and I hit the tree, and she died because I was too selfish to call a cab." I remembered Martinez mentioning his sister during our first day aboard, how she'd inspired his interest in marine biology before dying young. The creature was using that guilt against him, just like it had used Ernesto's grief over his daughter. "Doctor, there's nobody in the water. It's the creature creating those images." But Martinez wasn't listening. He was leaning forward, reaching toward the bioluminescent patterns, as if trying to touch someone's face. "Anna says the water isn't cold. She says it doesn't hurt. She's been waiting for me to apologize. I grabbed Martinez's shoulders and pulled him back from the rail, but he fought against me with surprising strength. His eyes remained fixed on the lights below, and his voice took on a pleading quality. "Please, David. She's been alone down there for 3 decades. I need to tell her I'm sorry." Sam helped me drag Martinez away from the water, but the doctor continued struggling and reaching toward the depths. We managed to get him seated against the bridge wall, but his eyes never left the ocean's surface. The engine room operator emerged from below deck looking pale and shaken. He approached us with the cautious movements of someone who'd seen too much. "Dr. Campbell, something's wrong with the sonar readings," he said. "The creature's signature is changing, getting more complex, like it's growing." I left Sam watching Martinez and followed the operator to the bridge. The sonar display showed our familiar massive contact, but now additional signatures were appearing around the primary target. Smaller shapes moved in coordinated patterns, suggesting the main creature was deploying some kind of appendages or offspring. The bioluminescent display below intensified as I watched, creating new patterns that seemed specifically designed to catch and hold human attention. Spirals of blue-green light rotated hypnotically, forming shapes that almost looked like faces or beckoning hands. I forced myself to look away from the water and focus on our deteriorating situation. Half the crew was showing signs of the creature's mental influence, and we'd already lost Ernesto during the night. Without immediate action, we'd lose everyone else before the day ended. Steadman's quarters had remained locked since the creature's first appearance yesterday afternoon. I'd heard movement inside during my watch shifts, footsteps pacing back and forth, occasional muffled sounds that might have been crying or prayers, but the captain hadn't responded to knocks or calls for almost 12 hours. The door was secured with a simple latch, but something heavy was pressed against it from inside. I had to throw my shoulder against the wood several times before whatever was blocking the entrance gave way enough to squeeze through. Steadman sat on his narrow bunk with his back against the bulkhead, a loaded flare gun in his hands. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, and his clothes were soaked with sweat. Charts and logbooks covered every surface of the small cabin, all open to pages documenting his previous encounter with the creature. "Captain," I said carefully, "we need your help on deck. The crew is—" "I know what's happening to the crew," Steadman interrupted, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I've seen it before. They're hearing the voices of people they failed to save. People who died because of their mistakes." He gestured toward the scattered papers around him. 15 years of research, David. 15 years trying to understand what that thing is and how it chooses its victims. I stepped closer, noting the detailed sketches of the creature's anatomy and behavioral patterns. Steadman had filled dozens of pages with observations and theories, documenting everything he remembered about the Aurora's destruction. "It doesn't hunt randomly," Steadman continued, his finger tightening on the flare gun's trigger. "The beast feeds on guilt and regret. It can sense emotional pain from miles away and use it as a weapon. People who've lost loved ones, who've made terrible mistakes, who carry the weight of others' deaths. Those are its preferred victims." I thought about Ernesto's grief over his daughter, Martinez's guilt about his sister's accident, and my own lingering pain over my parents' deaths from cancer. The creature was targeting our deepest emotional wounds and turning them against us. "How do we fight it?" I asked. Steadman's laugh was bitter and broken. "You don't fight it, David. You run. You get as far away as possible and pray it doesn't follow you. We can't run. The crew is compromised. Half of them won't leave the rail. And they're already dead." Steadman stood up from the bunk, the flare gun steady in his hands. just like the crew of the Aurora, just like everyone who gets too close to that thing. He moved toward the door, and I realized he intended to address the crew. His movements were jerky and desperate, like a man who'd made a terrible decision and was determined to see it through. "Captain, what are you planning?" "The truth," Steadman said simply. "The crew deserves to know why they're going to die." We emerged onto the deck where Sam was still watching Martinez and the other affected crew members. The bioluminescent display had grown even brighter, creating patterns so complex they seemed to contain actual images of people beckoning from the depths. Steadman gathered everyone who was still responsive, his voice carrying the authority of command despite his obvious emotional breakdown. "Listen to me carefully," he began, raising the flare gun so everyone could see it. "The Aurora was destroyed because I led my crew into dangerous waters against all safety protocols. I ignored weather warnings, sonar anomalies, and the Coast Guard's advice to turn back." His confession carried across the deck with painful honesty. 32 people died that day because I was arrogant enough to believe I could handle anything the ocean threw at us. The creature killed them, but I led them to their deaths. Sam looked confused and horrified. "Captain, what does this have to do with—" "Everything," Steadman said, his voice breaking. "The beast feeds on guilt, and I've been carrying 32 deaths on my conscience for 15 years. I brought it here by accepting this expedition, by sailing into its territory again." I realized with growing horror what Steadman was building toward. The flare gun wasn't meant for the creature. It was meant for himself. "I won't be responsible for more deaths," Steadman declared, pressing the flare gun against his chest. "I won't let my guilt kill anyone else." "Captain, don't." I started forward, but Steadman had already made his decision. The flare gun fired with a sharp crack, sending the burning projectile directly into Steadman's heart. He collapsed onto the deck plates, the chemical fire eating through his shirt and into his chest cavity. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the ocean breeze as Steadman's body convulsed once and went still. I dropped to my knees beside him, pressing my hands against the wound to stop the bleeding. But the flare had done too much damage. Steadman's eyes found mine for a moment, and his lips moved in what might have been an apology before the life went out of them completely. The creature's bioluminescent display pulsed brighter, as if feeding on the guilt and horror radiating from our small group. Dr. Martinez was laughing now, reaching toward the water with both hands while tears streamed down his face. The marine technicians had moved closer to the rail, their expressions peaceful and dreamy. Sam grabbed my arm, pulling me away from Steadman's body. His face was pale with shock, but his voice carried desperate urgency. "David, someone has to take command. We need orders. We need a plan, or we're all going to end up dead or missing." I looked around at the remaining crew. Maybe 4 people still capable of rational thought, with the rest either lost to the creature's influence or dead on the deck. The bioluminescent patterns below continued their hypnotic dance, promising peace and reunion to anyone willing to join them in the depths. The weight of command settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. I was a marine biologist, not a ship's captain. But I was the only one left who could make the decisions that might save us, if any of us could be saved at all. I knelt beside Rodriguez's motionless form on the deck, checking for any sign of consciousness. His eyes stared blankly at the creature's pulsing lights below, and his breathing had slowed to barely perceptible intervals. 2 hours since I'd taken command of the Leviathan, and we'd lost 3 more crew members to the beast's psychological assault. Not lost to the water like Ernesto, these 3 had simply stopped responding to the world around them. They sat or stood wherever the creature's influence had finally overwhelmed their minds, breathing but unreachable, trapped in conversations with people who'd been dead for years. Dr. Martinez continued his endless dialogue with his sister Anna. The marine technician Williams whispered apologies to someone named Marcus. Rodriguez spoke softly to his mother about forgiveness and coming home. Sam approached from the port side, his face grim with exhaustion and something close to despair. We'd been working together to maintain some semblance of crew function, but our numbers kept dwindling. "That's everyone except Thompson and Bailey," Sam reported. "They're still responsive, but barely. Thompson keeps looking at the water and muttering about his brother." I stood up from Rodriguez's side, wiping my hands on my pants. "How long before we lose them too?" "Hours, maybe less. The creature's getting stronger, or maybe we're just getting weaker. Either way, we're running out of time." I moved to the bridge and checked our radio equipment again, hoping against logic that something had changed. The communications array remained dead, not damaged, but somehow rendered completely silent whenever we tried to transmit. Every frequency produced nothing but static, as if the creature was blocking our signals through some mechanism I couldn't understand. The sonar display showed the massive contact directly beneath our keel, its signature pulsing in rhythm with the bioluminescent patterns visible through the water. Additional smaller contacts had appeared around the primary target, appendages or offspring, moving in coordinated sweeps that suggested intelligence and purpose. "David," Sam called from the deck, "you need to see this." I joined him at the rail where Thompson and Bailey stood transfixed by the light show below. The bioluminescent display had changed, becoming more complex and targeted, instead of the general hypnotic patterns we'd observed all night. The lights now formed specific images tailored to each observer. Thompson was staring at what looked like a young man's face formed in blue-green luminescence, his lips moving in a conversation about childhood promises and brotherhood cut short. Bailey watched a different section of the display where the lights created the outline of an elderly woman, her expression sad but welcoming. "It's learning," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The creature is reading our minds, finding our specific vulnerabilities, and exploiting them individually. Sam nodded grimly. "Gets worse. Look at the water temperature readings." He led me to the environmental monitoring station where the digital displays showed concerning data. The water around our hull had warmed by almost 10 degrees in the past hour, and thermal imaging revealed heat signatures rising from the creature's massive form below. "The thing's metabolism is increasing," I said, studying the readings, "like it's preparing for something big. Or feeding. All that psychological energy it's drawing from the crew. Maybe that's how it powers itself." I thought about the creature's behavior patterns, trying to apply scientific analysis to something that defied conventional biology. The beast had remained dormant on the ocean floor until our arrival triggered its ascent. Now it was actively harvesting emotional energy from human minds while preparing for some kind of major activity. "Sam, what if the bioluminescent organs aren't just for hunting? What if they're the creature's primary sensory and control system?" "You mean like a brain?" "More like a neural network distributed across its body. The lights aren't just lures, they're how it processes information and projects its influence." Sam caught on quickly to where my thinking was heading. "So if we could damage the light organs, disrupt its control system, maybe break its hold on the crew." We spent the next 30 minutes working out the details of what amounted to a desperate plan with almost no chance of success. The research submersible was still functional despite yesterday's impact damage, its hull intact and systems operational. More importantly, it carried high-intensity lights designed for deep-sea observation and a complement of explosive charges normally used for geological sampling. Thompson helped us prepare the submersible while Bailey stood guard over our catatonic crew members. Thompson's hands shook as he worked, and his eyes kept drifting toward the water where the creature's lights formed images of his dead brother. But he managed to focus long enough to help us mount the explosive charges around the submersible's exterior and wire them to a manual detonator. "The plan's insane, David," Sam said as we finished the modifications. "Even if you reach the creature's light organs, the explosion will destroy the submersible with you inside it." "Maybe not. The charges are shaped to direct the blast outward. If I position them correctly against the creature's neural network, I might survive the detonation." Sam's expression made it clear he didn't believe that any more than I did. We both knew this was a suicide mission disguised as a rescue plan. But with the crew falling victim to the creature's influence hour by hour, doing nothing guaranteed everyone's death. "I should be the one to take it down," Sam insisted. "You're needed up here to command the ship. You don't have the marine biology background to identify the creature's vulnerable points. I've spent my career studying bioluminescent organisms. I know how their neural pathways function." That was partially true, though no creature in the scientific literature compared to the monster lurking beneath our keel. Still, my expertise gave us the best chance of targeting the right organs for maximum effect. The submersible's systems came online with familiar electronic beeps and status displays. I ran through the pre-dive checklist while Sam monitored the creature's position on sonar. The massive contact remained stable at 300 feet below the surface, its appendages spread wide like a vast underwater web. "Thermal readings show it's getting more active," Sam reported, heat signatures intensifying across its entire body. I sealed the submersible's hatch and began the descent sequence. The craft dropped away from the Leviathan's hull with mechanical precision, its lights cutting through the dark water as I headed directly toward the creature's pulsing glow. At 100 feet, the creature's true size became apparent through the observation ports. The central body was enormous, easily larger than a blue whale, but the tentacles extending from its mass stretched hundreds of feet in every direction. Bioluminescent organs covered its entire surface like a constellation of stars, each one pulsing in complex patterns that created an overwhelming display of hypnotic beauty. At 50 feet, the creature noticed my approach and immediately began projecting images directly into my mind. My parents appeared in the submersible's lights, looking exactly as they had during their final days in the hospital. My father's voice filled the cramped cabin, weak but loving, asking why I hadn't visited more often during their cancer treatments. "You were so busy with your research," my mother said, her face pale but smiling. "We understood, David. We knew your work was important, but we missed you." I gripped the submersible's controls with white knuckles, fighting against the overwhelming guilt and regret. The rational part of my mind knew these were projections, hallucinations created by the creature to weaken my resolve. But the emotional impact felt completely real. "We're not angry, son," my father continued. "We just want you to come home. The water's warm here, and there's no more pain, no more cancer, no more watching us waste away while you stood helplessly beside our beds." The submersible shuddered as I pushed it toward the creature's primary light organ, a massive cluster of bioluminescent cells near what I assumed was its head. The organ pulsed with hypnotic patterns that seemed to contain entire galaxies of meaning, promising answers to every question and relief from every pain. 20 feet from the target, the creature's appendages began reaching toward my craft. Tentacles the size of subway cars moved with surprising grace, testing the submersible's hull with gentle touches that could have easily crushed the vessel. "You can't fight it, David," my mother's voice whispered. "You're just one person against something beyond human understanding. Come to us instead. Let the guilt go." I positioned the submersible directly against the creature's primary neural cluster and activated the manual detonator. The explosive charges created a brilliant flash that temporarily blinded me, followed by a shock wave that threw me against the cabin walls. The creature's response was immediate and devastating. It released a sound that had no comparison in my experience. Part roar, part scream, part electronic feedback that seemed to vibrate through every molecule of water around us. The bioluminescent organs across its body flickered and went dark, their hypnotic patterns replaced by chaotic flashing. But the beast wasn't dead or even seriously injured. Massive tentacles wrapped around the submersible with crushing force, metal groaning and buckling under pressure that exceeded the craft's design limits. Warning lights flashed across the control panel as hull integrity alarms screamed their urgent messages. Water began flooding the cabin through stress fractures in the observation ports. I struggled to reach the emergency ascent controls, but the creature's grip tightened with each passing second. The submersible's hull compressed around me like a closing fist, and I realized with growing horror that I was trapped inside what would become my coffin. Above me, the Leviathan's engines roared to life as the surviving crew attempted to escape the creature's wrath. But I was 300 feet below the surface, caught in the grip of an ancient predator that had just learned what human weapons could do to its nervous system. The last thing I saw before the observation port shattered completely was the creature's enormous eye, easily 20 feet across, turning to focus directly on my position. In that alien gaze, I saw intelligence older than human civilization and rage that burned with the fury of the deep ocean itself. Then the water rushed in, and everything went dark. The submersible's hull buckled inward with a metallic shriek that cut through the rushing water. Emergency lights flickered and died as seawater poured through the shattered observation port, the frigid Pacific flooding the cramped cabin faster than my mind could process. The creature's massive eye had turned away, but its tentacles maintained their crushing grip on my craft, dragging me deeper into the abyss with methodical purpose. I fumbled for the emergency release mechanism, my fingers numb from cold water and lack of oxygen. The manual override was located behind the pilot's seat, designed for situations exactly like this one. Metal groaned around me as the creature's appendages tightened, and I realized I had maybe 30 seconds before the submersible imploded completely. The release lever moved with a satisfying click, and the escape hatch above my head blew outward with explosive force. Compressed air from the emergency system propelled me upward through the opening, just as the cabin filled entirely with seawater. Behind me, the submersible disappeared into the creature's writhing mass of tentacles, crushed into unrecognizable debris. 300 feet of dark water stretched between me and the surface. My lungs burned from holding my breath, and the creature's damaged bioluminescent organs created chaotic flashes that disoriented my sense of direction. The beast thrashed below me, its movement creating powerful currents that threatened to drag me back into its reach. Hallucinations began almost immediately. My parents appeared in the water beside me, their faces serene and welcoming, as they swam through the creature's erratic light display. They reached toward me with gentle hands, speaking words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Promises of peace and rest, freedom from the guilt that had defined my adult life. "You tried your best, David." My father's voice echoed through the water. "You can stop fighting now." I kicked harder toward the surface, ignoring the burning in my chest and the growing darkness at the edges of my vision. The rational part of my mind knew these were projections from the creature's damaged neural network, desperate attempts to reclaim the psychological control I disrupted with the explosive charges, but the emotional impact remained devastating, sapping my strength with every stroke upward. The water temperature around me fluctuated wildly as the creature's wounded body released massive amounts of heat. Thermal currents created invisible barriers that required extra effort to penetrate, and my muscles began cramping from the combination of cold, exertion, and oxygen deprivation. About 200 feet from the surface, my vision started tunneling. The hallucinations intensified, showing me scenes from my childhood when my parents were healthy and proud of their marine biologist son. I saw Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies, family dinners where laughter filled the house instead of the smell of antiseptic and fear. "We never blamed you for staying away during the treatments," my mother whispered, her image floating just out of reach. "Your research was important. We understood why you couldn't watch us die." My chest convulsed as my body demanded air that wasn't there. The surface seemed impossibly far away, a faint glow barely visible through the murky water above. The creature's bioluminescent organs continued their chaotic flashing, creating patterns that pulled at my consciousness like physical hooks. 100 feet. My movements became sluggish and uncoordinated as oxygen deprivation affected my motor functions. The hallucinations blended with reality until I could no longer distinguish between my parents' faces and the random light patterns generated by the creature's damaged neural network. At 50 feet, something grabbed my arm with firm, human hands. Sam's face appeared through the dark water, his eyes wide with determination behind a diving mask. He pressed an emergency oxygen regulator against my mouth, and I breathed sweet, compressed air that tasted better than anything in my life. Sam wore full diving gear, mask, fins, wetsuit, and a portable oxygen tank strapped to his back. He must have grabbed the emergency equipment from the Leviathan's rescue locker and dove in the moment he saw the submersible's destruction. His presence cut through the creature's psychological assault like a beacon of reality in an ocean of manufactured dreams. We swam upward together, Sam's strong strokes compensating for my weakened condition. The shared oxygen regulator passed between us every few seconds, a rhythm of survival that felt both desperate and hopeful. Below us, the creature's thrashing had intensified, its massive form rising through the water column with obvious intent. The beast's damaged light organs flickered erratically, creating patterns that no longer held their hypnotic power. Random flashes of blue-green luminescence lit up the water around us, but without the coordinated neural control. They appeared chaotic and painful rather than mesmerizing. My explosive charges had disrupted something fundamental in the creature's biology. 20 feet from the surface, the Leviathan's hull became visible as a dark shadow above us. The ship's engines were running, creating vibrations that traveled through the water and into our bodies. Someone on deck had lowered the emergency rescue ladder, its aluminum rungs glinting in the filtered sunlight. But the creature wasn't finished with us. A massive tentacle swept upward through the water, easily 100 feet long and thick as a subway car. The appendage moved with surprising speed considering its size, reaching toward the Leviathan's hull with obvious destructive intent. Sam saw the approaching threat and immediately pushed me toward the rescue ladder while positioning his body between me and the rising tentacle. His actions were instinctive and selfless, the response of someone who'd spent his life taking care of others. "Go!" he shouted through his regulator, the word distorted by bubbles but unmistakably urgent. I grabbed the ladder's bottom rung just as the creature's appendage wrapped around Sam's waist with crushing force. The tentacle's surface was covered in what looked like suction cups, but were actually bioluminescent organs, each one pulsing with residual neural activity. Sam's face contorted in pain as the creature's grip tightened, and he dropped the oxygen tank to grab at the tentacle with both hands. "Sam!" I screamed his name and dove back toward him, but the creature was already dragging him downward with inexorable strength. Sam looked up at me through the darkening water, his expression calm despite the terror of his situation. He mouthed a single word, "Go," before the creature pulled him into the depths. I tried to follow, tried to reach him, tried to do something that might save the man who just saved my life, but hands grabbed my arms from above, hauling me up the rescue ladder despite my struggles. Thompson and Bailey pulled me onto the Leviathan's deck with desperate strength, their faces reflecting the same horror I felt. "Let me go!" I fought against their grip, trying to return to the water. "Sam's still down there." "He's gone, David," Thompson said, his voice breaking. "The thing took him too deep. You can't help him now." The Leviathan's engines roared to maximum power as the creature made one final assault on our ship. Tentacles the size of sequoia trees rose from the depths, reaching for the hull with murderous intent. The beast had learned from its encounter with the submersible. It wanted to destroy us completely rather than simply harvest our psychological energy. But the explosive damage had weakened the creature more than it initially appeared. Its movements lacked the fluid grace I'd observed earlier, and several of its appendages showed visible injuries where the charges had disrupted neural pathways. The tentacles reached within 20 feet of our hull before falling back into the water, the creature apparently unable to maintain the effort required for a sustained attack. The ship pulled away from the combat zone with agonizing slowness, our ancient engines straining against the Pacific swells. I stood at the stern rail watching the creature's bioluminescent glow fade beneath the waves, knowing Sam was somewhere in those depths, and knowing I'd never see him again. Dr. Martinez and the other crew members remained in their catatonic states, still trapped in conversations with the dead despite the creature's retreat. The beast's psychological hold had been damaged but not broken, leaving them suspended between reality and hallucination. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, appearing normal and peaceful under the afternoon sunlight. No sign remained of the ancient predator lurking in the depths below, no indication that we just encountered something that challenged every assumption about marine biology and the nature of life on Earth. But I knew the creature still lived. Wounded, perhaps permanently damaged, but alive and aware somewhere in the abyssal depths. It would heal eventually, adapt to the injuries I'd inflicted, and resume its patient hunt for ships that ventured too far from safe waters. As the Leviathan headed toward port, I realized the ocean would never feel the same. Every time I saw deep water or heard waves against a hull, I'd remember the creature's enormous eye focusing on my position and Sam's face disappearing into the darkness. The vast Pacific had become a graveyard, and somewhere in its deepest trenches, an ancient predator waited for the next ship to venture into its territory.